I just couldn't square that circle in my mind of like, well, why are you calling it a random act of violence when you clearly had months, years, sometimes decades of warning signs that this person was struggling and was thinking about doing violence and ultimately did. And so one of the big things that got me really dug in on this was I said that sort of that paradoxical message of random acts of violence. And I push back on that where my big hook is like, there is no such thing as a random act of violence. If you try to do a classic intervention on these individuals, you will be try to change their thoughts and opinions on something. You are attacking them personally, okay? And when we feel attacked personally, we dig in our heels. And especially if what you are attacking has been filling that bucket of identity, purpose, and community, right? We become very sensitive to that sort of stuff. What you can do is you can actually accelerate their radicalization and you can accelerate their isolation out of society, where they will begin to go back.
Stories in Stanza is a podcast exploring creativity, resilience, and the transformative power of human stories. Through our 2 series, Between the Lines with creators and Fail With Me focusing on wellness and life's challenges, we bring you authentic conversations with inspiring voices from around the world. If you are drawn to meaningful dialogue that both comforts and challenges, follow us on YouTube or any podcast platform. Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of Stories in Stanza. Today I'm joined by our guest Robert. Hi Robert, welcome to Stories in Stanza. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Wonderful. Today we'll be exploring a lot of interesting ideas with Robert. For our audience, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Robert Mahoney. I'm the CEO and founder of a consulting firm called TVTP Solutions. The acronym TVTP stands for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So we work with municipalities, primarily in the United States, but we are available for consulting anywhere in the world. But we work with municipalities, education centers and school districts, mental health and public health entities, as well as law enforcement, and then the general community at large, and community groups and other community institutions, departments of rec, sanitation, things like that, to let people know how the pathway of violence starts, how radicalization starts, and then how to interrupt that pathway so that you can get that individual the help that they need before they even begin to contemplate violence. As you go through that pathway, our sort of intercession methodologies and things like that become a little bit more, shall we say, aggressive. But the idea is to look very far upstream, to notice different behavioral patterns that are consistent throughout individuals who have committed attacks, irregardless of their motivation, to recognize those sort of behavioral abnormalities and be able to be proactive rather than sort of sitting back in a defensive posture and hoping that your protection or preparedness/response measures are going to hold.
Thank you for sharing that, and more importantly, taking up such important aspect of today's society. I look forward to hearing your ideas in today's episode. To get started, can you tell us a little bit about where this initiative began, when you started thinking about it, and what was your motivation behind starting this journey?
So about almost 20 years ago, I think around 2005. Obviously, I'm located, but you can tell by my accent, in the United States. And I was watching the Hurricane Katrina response, which was a hurricane down in Louisiana, and made sort of national news for the poor response that the government had done in order to save that city and a lot of people that were in it. And I remember thinking at the time that there was just certain things about that response that just felt so obvious to me, as somebody who wasn't familiar with how disaster response worked or anything like that. And so I went to grad school and got a master's degree in emergency and disaster management. And from there, I began to work my way up the ladder with, local county governments, up to the state, and then with the federal government. And what I ended up finding doing, going across both coasts of the country, doing different plans from earthquake plans to food distribution issues to nuke red to hurricane plans to all kinds of different things, was that it was more of a coordination issue. That those different levels of government and disaster response had specific viewpoints and context to what they were going to do in terms of how they prepared and what they were expecting the sort of next level or the level below them to do for them in times of response, and how that communication was going to go. And these were all things that took years and years of planning and relationship building to create that coordination and have that sort of seamless response typed in the event of a disaster. And as I moved forward in my career, there was this other sort of underlying happenings that were going on, obviously, in the United States, where more and more targeted violent shootings, more school shootings, and the like were becoming more and more prominent. And I began to hear this sort of paradoxical cross narrative that these were random acts of violence. But then 2 minutes later, the police chief or the mayor or somebody like that would admit that this individual had a long history of behavioral problems, that they were known to neighbors, to family, to classmates and things like that as being a problem, and that there was an escalatory sort of behavior of aggression and things like that. And I just couldn't square that circle in my mind of like, well, why are you calling it a random act of violence when you clearly had months, years, sometimes decades of warning signs that this person was struggling and was thinking about doing violence and ultimately did. And so I began to look and research more into that paradox, right? Like what was going on and how were these individuals slipping through the cracks? And what I ended up, as I became more immersed in it and I saw more science that clearly demonstrated that there was a clear pathway and a pattern that these individuals took, the types of behaviors that were being recognized, a movement away from sort of risk assessment to more behavioral threat assessment. I became more just hooked into it and realized that my experience in emergency management of bringing a lot of different players from different levels of government as well as outward to the community and getting those resources and creating those relationships and being able to do that coordinated response was something that I felt that I could probably would be beneficial to this avenue of work. And so I started up TVTP Solutions and have begun to educate people more on what to look for and how to approach this problem of targeted violence.
Thank you for sharing that background. Now, coming on to the core idea of behavioral threat assessment, let us understand the concept first. and then we will go into the next level. You said that your experience on crisis management led you to understand the behavioral aspects of it. So when we see a threat, how do we perceive it, and how do we look at the root causes? There was an event recently here in Australia that someone attacked a lot of people with a knife in a shopping mall, and later it was found out the same person had schizophrenia. So we didn't know that before, and then we realized that there were probably preventive actions could be taken. So when we see violence at the surface level, it is not just violence for its own sake. There is a deeper root cause behind it. Can you help us understand that from your point of view, the key aspects of what you are working on? What did you find, and what is it very important for us to know from an awareness point of view?
So there's a lot there, so buckle up. The first thing is that case that you just laid out with somebody with schizophrenia. That is actually sort of outside of the bell curve. It is one of the more rarer incidences where somebody has actual mental illness. In fact, only about 6 to 8% of people that commit targeted acts of violence have what would be diagnosed as a mental illness like schizophrenia. Many of them are what are termed, at least in this country, as mentally unhealthy or mentally, we'll just use mentally unhealthy. So suffering from poor coping skills, having depression, suicidal ideation, things like this are more prevalent and are the vast majority of individuals that commit this attack. Now, that isn't supposed to make anybody really feel any better about it, but when you look at it from a prevention standpoint, you at least realize that your intervention or your interruption methodologies have to be different than what you would use for somebody who has serious mental illness, right? And it actually helps from a prevention side because the interventions or intercessions methodologies that you can use actually don't have to be as clinical as they would be with somebody with mental illness. So from that, what you end up finding is that individuals that are struggling typically have compounding issues. And many of those issues would be termed as sort of risk factors. Now, risk factors is a terminology that looks from the outside in. So risk factors are not predictive in nature. So, and the reason why they aren't is because many of the people that have certain risk factors or live in risky areas or things like that, they don't look at what's around in their environment as a risk factor as much as they look at it as just life, right? And so what ends up happening because you have that outward to inward lens, our own sort of internal biases come into play when we start examining people for their risk factors and trying to make that leap to create sort of interventions or predictive behavior based upon risk factors, right? So if somebody has a very fondness for guns or has a fondness for violent video games or lives in a very poor area or has come from a family that of divorce, but also of certain domestic abuse and things like that. Boom, 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 all these check marks. Yes, this makes the probability of certain behaviors more probable, but it is not a predictive thing to do because we insert our own sort of thoughts and opinions and everything else onto that individual. When you look at behavioral threat assessment, you are examining how that individual is behaving, and you are using some more anthropologically proven things that human beings are more hardwired to look for. Our brains can only take a certain amount of wavelength. So what our brains do is they will prioritize the abnormal. And so many times you will see something or you'll hear something or you'll just sense something, and that feeling will create a behavior, and then our thoughts and opinions trickle down from that. And so we are focusing more on how is that individual behaving and what is going on in their lives holistically that is causing their behaviors to act out in an abnormal way. And so one of the key things from when we do trainings and stuff like that for behavioral threat assessment is that we try to dispel the idea that what you are looking for are threatening behaviors. And this is a contextual thing, and it's one of the things that being in this business, I often say right up front, I believe in the ethos, and it is scientifically proven that behavioral threat assessment is the gold standard of doing a threat assessment and doing prevention, but it is an awful, awful title, right? Because it frames your mind when we talk about behavioral threat assessment that I'm looking for behaviors that are threatening. What you are actually looking for are these snowballing effect incidences, these seemingly one-off instances that don't necessarily have anything to do with violence whatsoever, but are building up and compounding themselves, and that individual is struggling to cope with that amount of issues within their life. And their behavior is then acting out in a way to try to send out a signal, hey, I need help. We don't necessarily have the same empathy narrative with people who are bursting out in fits of anger or lashing out against a certain group of people, or are lashing out with a certain political ideology or certain religious ideology, as we do for somebody that we witness who is struggling with, let's say, substance abuse, right, or depression. We can see those signs, and we empathize with those, and we rush in a proactive way to try and get those individuals help. On the flip side, when you have somebody who's kind of ranting and raving, we generally say, like, hey, push them to the side, and I don't want to be a part of this because this looks like it's getting aggressive, and this person is not somebody that I need to be around because it's dangerous, or I feel uncomfortable around that individual. And so by changing that framing from looking at sort of threats in behavior to just general signs of struggle, and being able to be proactive to intercede as early as possible, you can then move individuals off this pathway. Because if you let it sort of fester, or you isolate it, and you have these individuals go into this downward spiral of isolation, it becomes harder and harder for that individual to off-ramp, really. And so I think we'll probably get into sort of more of the mechanics of that off-ramping, and then how people end up falling into that a little later on. But that is the general gist of sort of behavioral threat assessment.
When you were talking about this, I felt it speaks to the core theme of the podcast in many ways. When I talk about the mental health segment, I call that Fail With Me. And the reason for that is to be curious about what we are labeling as failure. at an individual level, at maybe at a social level, thinking, oh, okay, I failed at something and what to do next. That's rooted in my conditioning. So if I grew up being stigmatized or being led into guilt for that, then I'll never open up about failure. But if we open up about it, and then if we look at this from a lens of curiosity, then probably we will understand what is it that we are labeling as failure, and instead of addressing the effect, we address the root cause. And that's something I have been trying to build as a part of this podcast. We have this version of reality around us, but we see it through a lens of perception. That perception is basically conditioning. Could be a number of factors, but essentially conditioning. So when someone is behaving in a certain way, is based on how they feel and how they think. So at the core of it is the emotions and how we are processing it based on the conditioning. I like the way you talked about it is not an isolated incident. It's not just the threat that you have to see, but you become curious and go to the next level and understand where that behavior is coming from. And that's something I have talked about with many guests on the show. I wanted to hear more about that discovery. And is it possible for you to give us some example and then see how it fits into that broader context, that this is what happened and this is what led us to find or take actions upon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. So much of our behaviors are contextual. If I say the same thing in two different ways, you have a completely different feeling in how you respond. And I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding when we're talking about behaviors in what motivates behaviors. Like, how does that flow go? And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I'll reiterate it because it's so important. Many people think that thoughts and opinions are the things that create behavior. And it's the direct opposite. In fact, all behavior stems from a certain feeling. And your behavior puts out, goes into overdrive based upon that feeling. And then our thoughts and opinions flow after that, right? And then oftentimes what we have to do is we can't necessarily explain the behavior that we did, because we really can't explain the feelings, or we don't have an idea necessarily in our heads as to why we did something. So then we try to post-rationalize our behavior through our thoughts and opinions. But it doesn't go up. It doesn't go thoughts, behaviors, feelings. It goes feelings, behaviors, thoughts. And that's a really important thing when we start getting more and more into how do we off-ramp these individuals, is to understand that flow, right? To go back into the contextual sort of thing of how we, I don't want to say manipulate, but how we contextualize certain things that might be saying the same thing. If I say that a certain event is going to happen and 8% of the world's population will die, that creates a feeling of, oh my gosh, that is a huge event in world history, and I need to be prepared. And you're going to be more attentive. Your behavior is going to become more attentive to what is going to be said, to get more information so that your thoughts and opinions of what you need to do are more informed. If I say that after an event, 92% of the world's population will survive, that has a completely different feeling and context, right? And you might not be as attentive to the instructions after I mentioned that at the forefront, that 92%. You're going to assume that you're going to be in that because it's such a super majority of the world's population. You might take a listen as to like what part of the world they think is probably going to be the most hit. But if it doesn't really concern you, you're probably just going to pass it off, and your thoughts and opinions are going to be just off. It's the same thing if I have like a subscription to a service or something like that. If I tell you it's only $1 a day, you have a certain contextual thought and feeling about, or feeling and behavior on that. If I tell you it's $365 a year, it's a different thing. It feels like a hurdle, right? And how we contextualize things and how we phrase things really changes how we feel, which changes our behavior. And so one of the big things that got me really dug in on this was, I said, that sort of that paradoxical message of random acts of violence. And I push back on that, where my big hook is like, there is no such thing as a random act of violence. It just doesn't exist. And when we use that terminology, what it does is it moves our minds into a more defensive posture, where we begin to overvalue protection, preparedness, and response measures, because we have been told that it's random. We don't know who's going to attack. We don't know when, and we don't know where, and we don't know how, right? And so by all means, if that's the case, put as many lines of defense as you possibly can between me and whomever. And what we end up, but that is just not true. So we've had this hardening of sites, more law enforcement, more security personnel, more cameras and more surveillance, more bars on windows, more metal detectors that we have to go through, more scanners, everything else, because we have framed this targeted violence sort of issue as we have to be defensive rather than proactive. Because if after the attack, if you knew that this individual from the age of 5 had been showing behavioral signs of aggression, mental health, have had numerous run-ins with this individual, police and law enforcement have gone to this individual's house a number of times for various different reasons, like, that's not random, right? And so what is it that is preventing us from that sort of that coordination, from being proactive? And here in the United States, and probably in Australia as well, that you probably have a slogan that's somewhat similar to, like, see something, say something, right? And that we've had a generation since 9/11 of that kind of being just integrated into our psyches. The problem is that we don't have a reporting problem, right? See something, say something is a reporting messaging that, like, if you see something wrong, go ahead, even though it doesn't say what you're supposed to see or look out for, but we all know what it means. It say something, say what, say to who, doesn't say, but we all intrinsically know what the behavior is that we're supposed to do. But we don't have a reporting problem. You have over 2/3 of individuals after they've done an attack that elicited some sort of concern within the community. We have in the United States state analytics in certain states that know, at least from a suicide study that is somewhat similar to targeted violence, 98% of people who committed suicide within 1 year in a certain an American state in Vermont, that's close to where I live, they found that within 1 year of them committing suicide, they were getting assistance from one public assistance entity. 78% of the people that committed suicide within the state of Vermont in 1 year were in 3 or more databases of public assistance, right? We know who they are, where they are, what their struggles are, and whatnot. What we have is a coordination problem, okay? We have created systems that are hyper focused on one particular issue or one particular risk factor. And those systems, as is what tends to happen to systems, become extremely rigid. Okay. And then you might find networks within those systems that sort of cross over to other systems. But they're usually very, very thin and fragile, where if one person from that network leaves, or if you have somebody retire or something like that, the whole sort of network kind of collapses and the system just goes back to being single tracked. Right? And we call this sort of like stovepiping or single tracking, and there's lots of terminology for it. Within those systems, we put different sort of restrictions or thresholds that individuals that we're focused in on have to cross over in order for a response to happen, right? So if law enforcement comes to your home and you're not doing anything illegal, you're not crossing over that threshold, right? They can't really do a whole lot from their lane to interrupt what you're doing, right? If you go to mental health, they will ask you, are they a threat to themselves or others? And if you say, well, no, not yet, they'll tell you, get in the back of the line, right? Because I've got a stack of people who are, and I've only got so many clinicians. So we're going to have to wait until that individual kind of crosses over this threshold, and then we'll initiate our response. And you see this threshold sort of permeate throughout all kinds of different things. I've worked with a lot of different public health or public assistance sort of agencies, and they will tell me they know if you're a first-time recipient of food stamps by month 3, week 2, day 4, you're going to come in again for housing assistance, right? But there is nothing in place for the food stamp people to talk to the housing people. And so we end up putting the onus of the responsibility of navigating these crises on the person that's in crisis, right? They don't know that in 2 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days, they're going to have a housing issue. They're just concerned about their crisis right now, which is getting food on the table, right? And these are the types of things that are, because they don't qualify or because they don't know where the next crisis is going to come, they are just falling down the hill, going from crisis to crisis to crisis. And things begin to stack up and compound, and one issue becomes 6 issues, which becomes 12 issues, and it just becomes unmanageable. And you have people who just break, right? The amount of struggle that is there begins to wear down on their psyche and their emotional well-being. And as human beings, we all look for, I have a metaphor of the 3 buckets theory. And we all look for things that will fill these 3 metaphorical buckets, which is identity, purpose, and community. And we will go and find things that sort of fill that buckets. Now, some of us have maybe 6 or 8 things that fill our identity buckets, and 12 things that fill our purpose. And we have good family ties and good community ties and everything else. And so we're cooking with gas on that sort of thing. But you can see as life progresses, you'll get shocks to the system, right? You'll have a breakup, or you'll lose a job, or you'll change jobs, you'll move to a different city. A family member or a friend might die, or things like that, and it takes a little shock to the system. What ends up happening sometimes is that, actually all times, is that our brains find it completely unacceptable to not know who we are. Okay. And in the absence of knowing who we are, we will go and find and search for things that will fill that bucket, right? And so oftentimes it is not necessarily the message that is resonating with people. It is those intangibles that come with the message. So for instance, whether it's a religious thing or a political thing or a societal thing, I may not necessarily agree with everything, but what I find in it is it's filling that bucket, right? I find a group of people that are accepting of me, or I find a purpose that I feel is altruistic and that I connect with. I find an identity that I've been searching for. And this isn't just your typical teenager, like, oh, where do I fit in kind of thing. We see people after divorces have a complete identity crisis. We see people who retire have a complete identity crisis. We see people who get out of the military and have an identity crisis, right? And so you, whether it is with your purpose or whether it is with your community or whether it's with your identity, these sort of shocks to the system, the brain forces us to go and find things. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is once we find something that sort of fills that bucket, we like, oh, great. And we just stick to it like glue, right? And if that thing combined with all the other risk factors and all the other crises that are going on ends up isolating us from society, they begin to become sort of quote unquote radicalized, right? And now this is like an interesting terminology because there really isn't a better term for it. And we often equate radicalization with negative aspects. But I'll give you some positive aspects. Alcoholics Anonymous, the group that helps people get sober and everything else, uses this same sort of methodology, right? Hi, I'm Rob. I'm an alcoholic. Boom, there's my identity. My purpose is to get clean. My community are all the other people within this meeting that I'm meeting who also identify as alcoholics and who are going to help me through my process of getting clean. They're going to lean on me. I'm going to lean on them. And so you can see identity, purpose, community. Boom, I'm locked in, right? We saw this during COVID as well, where you had public health experts who have spent decades in the field of public health, have all the degrees and everything else. They identify as a public health expert, right? Their purpose is to relay public health information so that the public is safer or is safe as they can be. And then the community is other public health people that have similar interests. When that got, during COVID, when that started being punctured or questions were being raised and everything else, they took great offense to it, right? Because it had morphed from just a job to all of a sudden, this is my identity. It's a personal attack, right? Because whether it's the Alcoholics Anonymous or whether it's the public health or whether it's religious extremism or whether it's political extremism or whatever, when it intertwines to the point where it becomes who you are, going back to how sort of behaviors flow from an emotion, behavior, thoughts, and opinions. If you try to do a classic intervention on these individuals, you will be try to change their thoughts and opinions on something. You are attacking them personally, okay? And when we feel attacked personally, we dig in our heels. And especially if what you are attacking has been filling that bucket of identity, purpose, and community, right? We become very sensitive to that sort of stuff. And what you can do is you can actually accelerate their radicalization and you can accelerate their isolation out of society, where they will begin to go back. They will seek comfort in that thing and only that thing, right? When we start talking about interventions and how we interrupt this process of whether it's to the point of radicalization or it's migrated into sort of this radicalization and then into sort of a mobilization of violence and the pathway of violence, we have to understand that it's a completely different intervention methodology. And I don't like the word intervention because I think when you use it, intervention has a very top-down power dynamic. Okay, we use intervention for people with substance abuse because they physically cannot do what they need to do in order to get clean without somebody coming over and sort of like taking the reins and walking them through the steps, right? As I just mentioned, we can't have that top-down power dynamic with somebody who, let's just say, has been radicalized to something. It becomes a personal attack. So what you need to do is you need to treat this more as an interruption or an intercession, or even better yet, a negotiation. Think of this as a hostage negotiation. They don't have a chemical dependency, as you would with substance abuse. What they have is an emotional and psychological dependency to something, okay? And we are only as faithful as our options dictate. So if you go into a bank robbery and you come in with like this idea that you are going to change the mind of the bank robber, you're going to have a lot of shot hostages at the end of it, okay? And a lot of hurt people. What hostage negotiators will do is they will basically try to flip the script and create different options for the person that is holding up that bank to then get them to think that they are somewhat in control of the behaviors that they're doing. Okay, yes, we're getting you your helicopter, but to show us that you're serious about this, why don't you just let out one of the hostages, right? Let's just have a rapport here. We heard what you said about getting the helicopter. We're getting the helicopter, but we don't want to see anybody getting hurt, right? And then they're like, yeah, I don't want to see anybody getting hurt. I want this to be a trustful thing. And then so they send somebody out, right? It's the same sort of thing, but you have to showcase those options of a new identity, a new purpose, and a new community that is available to them to go towards. Okay, if there is nothing there to off-ramp them, or if, using that sort of bucket and spout metaphor, if the trickle of the new thing is not at the same strength as what they're already on, they're not going to go. Okay, so you need to showcase that they can get more. There's more to offer on these options than what they have, and we've seen a lot of individuals who have done and committed attacks in their writings, whether it's in their manifestos or their diaries or their journals and things like that, expressing regret of what they are about to do. They understand consciously that they're going to cause a lot of harm. They apologize to their family. They apologize to the potential victims' families, and they say that they're sorry and everything else. We on the outside can't rationally understand if you are writing that down and you know that you are going to do something so heinous, why you can't stop, right? And the reason why is because, again, they are emotionally and psychologically fixated on this thing. This is a means to an end. And going back a little bit earlier of seeing those sort of behavioral signs of escalation as signs of help rather than signs to run away from is really, really important. In the same way that people with suicidal ideation sometimes will test the waters to see who's going to come to their rescue, right? They'll do some very risky behaviors and see if that risky behavior elicits some type of response. And when it doesn't, they amp it up just a little bit, right? And then all of a sudden they're standing on the edge of the bridge and they're waiting for somebody to come and get them. And if nobody does, eventually they give up. It is very slightly similar with the pathway of violence, where you will begin to see different escalating behaviors that are repulsive, that we push away, but are actually subconscious signs of asking for help. And so the pathway goes through these stages of you have a grievance, which really isn't that big of a deal. We all have grievances. What ends up being a big deal is when those grievances mutate into an ideation, right? And this is where we see, from what I've said, the identity, purpose, community, it becomes their raison d'etre of why they are who they are. As that ideation begins to flow down this pathway, what you will see is a research phase. They may be researching to confirm more of their ideation. They may be researching past attackers. They may be researching the patterns of a certain target. So whether it's a certain site or whether it's a certain group, when do they gather? What are the different types of things that they do? And then that will move into a preparatory phase. They may scope out, they may acquire weapons, they may become more efficient with weapons that they already have, et cetera, et cetera. And then there'll be a breach, which is the final stage before an attack. Now, breaching is usually an extremely overt sort of expulsion of intent. A Facebook post with a bunch of guns, with a date and a time, and some type of manifesto that gets released and things like that. The thing with breaching is that it can be that expulsion of intent can be incredibly finite between when that is released and when the attack happens. And typically, most of our proactive response that we do is trying to fit within that very slim window, okay? What we don't realize is that breaching has been going on throughout this entire process, okay? We will be breaching. You will hear them talk about their intent. You will hear them talk about their isolation. You will hear them talk about, hey, what would happen if this? Or what do you think the reaction would be if somebody said something like this, right? These are all of the same sort of testing the market kind of behaviors to see if somebody's going to come and respond and help them out, and offer them an off-ramp. And when it doesn't happen, you see what ends up happening. From the reason why I focus so much on prevention is that we as humans are really bad at assessing value to things. We have a show here in the United States called The Price is Right. It's been on, I think, for like 40, 50 years. It's an American staple. They have people kind of come up and guess the value of an all-expense-paid trip to Mexico and a 14 cubic foot refrigerator and a car and all this other stuff. And nobody knows what the actual value is. We have a weird thing with assigning a quantitative value onto different things. And so when we talk about going back to like the random acts of violence and how that shifts our brain to more of a protection and response mindset, we have overvalued those protection measures and those response measures. It's not to say that there isn't a place for them and that there isn't any value. There is considerable amounts of value to them. It is just that we have overvalued them, and we have dismissed or we have undervalued the approach of preventing these attacks from ever happening. One of the classic sort of examples of this happened in Dayton, Ohio, a few years back with a man named Connor Betts. So Connor Betts, from the moment he fired his first shot to the moment he was killed, was 32 seconds. Okay. He killed 9 people and injured, I believe, 27 or 29 people. He traveled all of 100 feet. He was on a road on a late Saturday, early Sunday morning, where a lot of bars and restaurants and everything else were filtering out for at the end of last call. There were 6 to 8 officers that were already on scene just for general, crowd control and everything else. And yet he was able, within 32 seconds, with cops there, right, in 100 feet, to do that amount of damage. From a response standpoint, it's going to be really hard for any law enforcement agency to get better than that. But when you look at Connor's history leading up to that attack, he had issues from 4 years old. He had been in and out of suspensions from school, expelled from school, mental health clinicians talking to him at various points, talking to his parents. Police had gone to his home a number of times. He had become isolated. Not many people around town were his friends. He began writing more and more violent stories and violent journals and expressing himself in more violent ways. And you had well over a decade of these sort of warning signs that something was brewing and something was amiss and that this individual was really struggling. And the more value you put on the idea that these defensive measures are going to, or these response measures are going to be able to be there to save you, or that they are going to respond in time, is a false pretext. And it is something that we need to balance out how we look at security. Michelin does this with actually restaurants, right? So we all think of Michelin as concentrating on the food. You go to a restaurant, a Michelin restaurant, and you know you're going to have exquisite food. Yes, but you don't get the Michelin stars just on food. You get the Michelin stars on 3 things, actually: ambiance, service, and food. Okay? There have been studies on behavioral economics and they came up with the conclusion that human beings cannot tell the difference between the man that cooks the food and the boy that sweeps the floor, right? It's all encompassing within the experience. And so by having any of those things out of whack, you lose a Michelin star. The experience is not up to the standard. I believe that we need that balance. We need to take that approach. We need to have a balance of prevention, protection, and response in coordination to have effective and holistic security to keep all of our communities safe. And so that is a balancing act of how do we do that, right? Because narratives and how we perceive and how different contextual cues for us really change our feelings about a space and our behaviors in it. And so, for example, I use the example of going into a liquor store one time in a city here in the United States, and as I'm approaching the liquor store just to get a 6-pack of beer, I see outside cameras, I see bars on the windows, I see there's a huge, harsh fluorescent light right by the door. The door is reinforced. I go into the door with the alarm that pings that somebody has opened the door. I'm in this little holding area. There's a metal detector. I go through the metal detector. I get wanded by a security guard once I go through the metal detector. Finally, I'm allowed to go into the actual store, to which I see floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. I see the CCTV TVs showing me in the store and then showing what's going on outside the store. And then I have to do all of my commerce through a drawer. And in that moment, I realized that two things. One, this is the safest place I think I've ever been in my entire life. And two, this is the scaredest I have ever been in a place ever. Because the narrative wasn't, oh, look at all these security measures. Aren't I in a safe place? It was, look at all these security measures. What the hell goes on here that they felt the need to put all of these things in place? And there's a delicate balance in how we project our protection and our security. And it's not always bars on the windows and cameras and security guards. In fact, many times removing those things actually creates a better sense of security. And I've come up with this haiku sort of Zen type security thing where, as a security professional, one of your jobs within an environment and within a space is to make the water as still as possible so that you can tell what's causing the ripple. And going back to our anthropological way of how we look for abnormalities in the world. It is one of the reasons why many people believe that water is clear and tasteless and odorless, is because if water looked like Red Bull, okay, and tasted like Red Bull and smelled like Red Bull, it would be very difficult for us to discern whether or not that water had something wrong with it, right? And so by constructing our senses to, it's supposed to be, there's no smell to it, it's supposed to be clear, and it's supposed to taste like nothing, that actually helps us from an evolutionary and survival standpoint to recognize if one of those things is a little off, right? And so when we want to, as a security professional, by making things as still as possible within the environment, you are more apt to see those little micro ripples and be able to address those. Because if you put all this stuff in the environment that creates a lot of noise and creates a lot of vibrations and things like that, what you do is you prioritize the things that are right in front of your face. And oftentimes, from a security standpoint, those little ripples are things that you can knock out of the way. You can get those, you can take care of those relatively easy, but because there's so much noise, you're not able to focus in on those things. And so that's when those are when those threats begin to filter through the cracks. And so how you create that balance and how you formulate those environments is something that is a really humanistic kind of experiment. And it's something that a lot of security professionals put to the back burner. Things like a doorman, right? There's a theory of the doorman fallacy where you have a man with a top hat and a long coat, and they're outside of a hotel, and they're outside of a restaurant or an apartment building or something like that. And we can reduce the usefulness of that individual as just opening and closing doors, right? When in actuality, when you see a doorman, if you're coming up to a hotel that has a doorman, you actually stand up straighter, your posture, your whole behavior changes. You people who go to places where there's valet service and they'll get out of their car and they completely change their behavior, how they interact with individuals and things like that. That customer service kind of relationship that ends up happening, or that narrative that, hey, I'm going into a place of where this is a serious place, right? This is an expensive place, or this is a serious place. There's a way in which I need to act. That actually has more profound security value than any camera or any reinforced door or anything like that. If you take that dynamic of the hello, how are you? Oh, nice to see you again, doorman kind of thing, and you just put a security professional with wrap sunglasses, police, security, strapping a gun to their side and everything else, completely changes the context, right? Completely changes people's behavior, completely changes the feelings about that space and everything else, and actually makes it more difficult to discern what odd behavior is, right? And so these are the types of things that when we take on clients and what we do, we try to examine this holistic way of how are they approaching this problem? Are they looking more defensive? Are they not considering the pathway and have a real solid prevention methodology that has been integrated in how they do business? How connected are they to the other aspects of the town or the city or the state for other research? So this individual might be an absolute terror at school, but after school he goes to this sports program with the Department of Rec and they completely see him completely differently. Or he goes to a house of worship and they don't see anything, right? Or there's a job program that he's in, and you people in completely different ways. And I think one of the things that we have seen when we work with these institutions is that they're always dealing with a quarter of the story, right? They are acting on what they can do with the limited amount of interaction or information that they have based upon their interaction within the system. They are not connected to the overall character arc or connected to other systems that have interacted with this individual to see what is actually going on. We've had individuals who have threatened to kill their entire classroom, and all they wanted to do, they just were upset that the kids in the class were not taking the subject matter as seriously as they were, because they really liked that subject matter. And all we had to do from an interruption standpoint was to move them to an elevated class of individuals who were taking it more seriously, and all the behavior problems went away. We've had individuals who have been ranting and raving and saying that they're going to do something aggressive or violent, and we've instituted them. There was a small pottery business up in northern New Hampshire who offered this individual to come into one of her pottery teaching courses, and this individual just took to it immensely. And all of a sudden, this pottery thing gave them a sense of purpose, gave them a sense of identity and community. He now works at that business. He's doing the teaching classes for pottery and stuff like that. So sometimes it's just a little knock to the side. It's just a little bit of what are these individuals connecting with? What are they not connecting with? But you need the entirety of the story in order to be able to decipher like where you're going to go with it.
That was so deeply informative, and thank you for explaining that pathway and how your organization works, how you go from reactive to preventive, and especially the aspects of identity, purpose, and community. It was very well explained. And I'm curious to understand that when you start engaging, when you start consulting, working with people, at some stage you gave some brilliant examples that when people are in that pathway, in that escalation towards violence, there is a no turning point as well for them. It is possible that they get too fixated and then they begin isolating themselves. Excuse me. What I'm curious to understand is when you work with people, do you see that they are capable of changing? Because you said that there is a point of no return as well. Then when you start engaging, how do you see that you handhold them or maybe comfort them to see where they are heading and bringing them back or making them feel more grounded and secure?
I feel that it is actually, if you can provide those options that I described, if you can showcase that those buckets will be filled by doing something else. And maybe it is just, let's just take one step a little bit and just see how you like it, right? Or let's just try this out. And you're not combating, you're not trying to force your thoughts or opinions onto what they are saying, right? You are listening to it. It can go in one ear and out the other, but you want to get within that sort of circle of trust. You want them to understand that you are there to listen to them, as asinine or as crazy as their ideas are. That is their reality. And that is something that you have to just accept. They are in it now. All right. This is what they are attaching to. They will attach to something else, but they need to know that there is something else to attach to. You cannot just have them or expect them to just jump back into the void of not having an identity, not having a community, not having a purpose, because their brains just are not going to do that. Okay. That is a step too far, because it's just something that our brains don't accept. We're not going to jump off this train and then hope that we're able to find something. I've already found something, right? As destructive as it might be, and it might lead to me being killed or me committing suicide or other people being killed. This is the track I'm on, because there is nothing there for me to off platform, right? And in the absence of that, I'm just going to keep going. And you can't try to convince them from a logical and reasonable approach that what they are doing is destructive. You have to show them, you have to go into that core of the feelings that they are getting, the emotions that are tied to this, and try to tap into those to get those feelings to migrate to something else.
You briefly touched upon this when you were explaining the pathway towards violence, that people can be instigated or can be triggered by different factors. And one of the brilliant ones is the shop environment that you explained. There is a particular bit that I'm curious to hear from you, is that we go into social media today. The algorithms are built in a way that whatever creates that commotion, whatever creates that divisiveness or argument or those triggers, they get promoted. When you are talking about calmness or mindfulness, that's probably you're trying to send out something generic or something encouraging that probably doesn't get that much of engagement, whereas something more disruptive, even though that's harmful, they get picked up and encouraged by that huge layer of information processing. And I get a condition to make people think that, oh, everything is wrong around the world, and they see what they want to see.
Well, I think that social media is the algorithms are designed for engagement, right? And one of the biggest hooks for engagement with you have to outdo. I think it's for one negative thing that you see, you have to find three positives to just negate that one negative, right? And if you are looking for engagement to have people stay on and things like that, the promotion of those negative things is going to capture our attention a lot quicker and a lot more visceral than the positive stuff. And so it's to the algorithm's benefit, and it's to the media company's benefit to keep promoting those types of things, because those are the things that are going to get the most engagement, and those are the things that are going to make us stay locked in, right? If you say like everything's great or everything's great. Now there's an interesting dynamic within social media, because you will see all of the negative things, and then you'll have this mixed message of a certain group or class of people that are jet setting around the world and going to private parties on private jets and everything else, and that sort of makes you feel as though your status in life is less than, right? Like everybody's there's so much garbage that's happening on in the world, and yet these people seem to be just like floating above it, and I'm stuck in here and everything else. And you can see how that sort of grievance begin to boil and begin to take hold. And if you constantly have that algorithm feeding you this stuff, you can just see how it becomes, and we're all susceptible to it, right? Like the dopamine hit that we get, the chemical hit in our brains when we see things on social media, we think that we are somehow connected through social media, through the world. But as soon as we turn off our phones, that dopamine just drops. Where this conversation, even though it's virtual, our dopamine it'll fade out over the next couple of hours, and then we'll have another interaction and it'll go up. So that's why you see these youth, or even us at my age and things like that, where we're always on our phone like it's a cigarette, right? Like I gotta get my hit of dopamine, because every time I turn this off, my brain just shuts off that dopamine, and it's like, what? Wait a second, what happened? Turn that thing back on, right? Like I need that. That's what we need, and that's where the engagement sort of algorithm takes hold. Is that we are getting that feed into us. Sometimes obviously beyond our control, and we don't necessarily know why we're so addicted to this thing, or why we have to turn it on, or why we're getting so angry about these things. And it's because of the environment that is being constructed for us to interact with.
Thank you for explaining that. And I was curious to understand, you explained the path to violence so well. The contributing factors, the triggers, the conditioning, society. And we looked at it from all the different lenses. And to conclude our discussion, I wanted to come back and focus on your organization, and that could be the takeaway for anyone listening to this. Is you mentioned how you consult and how you try to be more preventive than reactive, and who do you work with, and how do you consult with people, and how can someone in any other sort of agency from around the world can engage with you. If we could conclude around those lines, then probably it'll be more informative towards people who are listening to this conversation.
So, yeah, so the best way to get in touch with me to talk about more in depth of what your needs might be or what your organizational intent and things like that might be is just to go to our website. So that's TVTP Solutions.com. So Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention Solutions.com, TVTP. And what we can do is we can assess what industry are you? Are you education, public health, governmental, law enforcement, house of worship, community action group, whatever. And then we can begin to delve into sort of, okay, what are your needs? Is this just sort of basic education like you got here, but just in a more in-depth way for your particular organization or your particular group? Do you already have sort of prevention methodologies put in place that need to be examined or augmented? Do you want your prevention things to spread out? Like, are you looking to do more coordination with different groups and things like that? So we'll make those sort of assessments, and then we'll begin to develop our services around that. We do have bespoke trainings. So when I talk to the house of worship, there's a different context that I put this in so that I get them more proactive and get them to understand where their role plays within this prevention sort of spectrum than it would be if I was talking to more security or law enforcement professionals, right? They have a different sort of contextual sort of way in which they go about it. In the United States, many law enforcement have on the side of their cars protect and serve. It doesn't say prevent and serve. And so there's a different contextual framing that they look at what their roles and responsibilities are within this prevention spectrum than, say, maybe like mental health or the education sector look at it. And so we examine that thoroughly with our clients first, and then we devise a game plan around what their wants, what their needs are in that sense. But there's a contact page on the website, tvtpsolutions.com. By all means, we can do in person, but we can also do virtual, knowing that we are global as well. So we can do virtual trainings and virtual consults and things like that. And there's also a YouTube page and a media page that's associated with the website. So I've done a couple of, I think about 10 or 12 educational videos where I explain my philosophy and the philosophy of the company and the prevention aspects of things. And then obviously all of our interviews, this will be up there when it goes live on our website for people to watch and listen to. And so you get a better perspective of the wide range of audiences that I talk to and promote this prevention methodology towards.
Sorry, I said the last question, but there's this one more thing this fantastic discussion demands is, what if someone has a loved one who has gone through this phase? Something for them.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you pointed that. So I don't have, please contact your local mental health or your local law enforcement or somebody that you trust that can connect with that individual and explain, now that I've explained it to you, if it's understandable of what you are seeing matches what I've said, it's probably easier for you now to explain to others what is happening. And that will get those institutions probably up and running in a different way. I don't have a MD or a clinical certification to take on sort of those cases to off-ramp those individuals. That is not that is not what we do at the company. It's not what I do. I have partners within the United States that specialize in that. But my goal is to really get people on the bus of, yes, I believe in this philosophy. I think this is a good way of approaching this problem, far better than what we have been doing. Let's give it a try. Let's try to institute it in our town, in our cities, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, etc. If there is somebody that is showing those signs of isolation, aggressive behavior, escalatory behavior, things like that, by all means, contact your local people that can handle that and can do that sort of intercession or interruption on your behalf. We are not able to do that, and we're not proficient enough to take on a case in that sort of way.
Yes. No, I know that your organization works in the different sort of area, but I thought of bringing that up for context.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, because I've gotten calls, right? I've gotten calls and like, oh, my uncle has this problem, that problem, and I'm like, go call the police. I don't I don't know what to tell you. Like, yeah, it sounds like you got a problem there. Like, this is not. I'm glad that you listened to what I had to say and you recognize that uncle is having a problem. But I am not the one that is going to be able to necessarily off-ramp that individual. That it has to be done at a personal and local level with people within the community. So.
Of course. I would also like to add to our listeners and viewers on YouTube that we will, of course, put the links in the episode description. If you want to contact both the website and the contact page, you'll have some summary information about what your organization does and how can someone engage you. And at the same time, this was a very lengthy discussion. Once the episode goes live, it will be converted into a blog post and it will be there on Substack. So there is this discussion that would be in YouTube and audio podcast platforms. But if you want to reflect back what we covered, all of the takeaway, the discussion summary would be there in our Substack page so that you can refer back to it. You can share with anyone who needs to. Thank you once again, Robert, for your time and such wonderful thoughts, joining Stories in Stanza and the phenomenal work that your organization is doing.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you platforming me. I'd be happy to come back if you wanted to deep dive on more of this. For right now, thank you so much for letting me talk.